Hello, this is Todd Lewis, your host. This is our third Lyceum debate. The proposition we will be debating this afternoon is which is more anti-fragile, republics or monarchies? Now, due to the coin toss for Decadent goes first. So Decadent, your 10 minutes for opening statement begins now.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, Todd. The debate concerns whether or not monarchy is more anti-fragile than republics or republicanism. So my argument is essentially, well, first off, for those who don't know, anti-fragile means that which improves under disorder, which is that which strengthens under chaos. Now, quoting Bertrand de Jovenel, he differentiated the difference between monarchy and republicanism, or monarchy and democracy. Sometimes republicanism and democracy are used interchangeably. He differentiated them by defining monarchy as the sovereignty of the law, and defining republicanism, as you might have guessed, the sovereignty of the people. And if I can just grab what he said here. I have the book with me. All right. So, as I was saying, how monarchy is more anti-fragile than republicanism lies in its foundation of the sovereignty of the law. What this essentially means is that the law is considered sacred. Now, for institutions like the church, for instance, or maybe even aristocratic institutions, the nobility, for instance, they would usually reaffirm the king or the monarchs or the emperor. They would reaffirm his position, make him know his place, because the essence of monarchy is essentially a kind of hierarchical perspective, a kind of hierarchical Weltanschauung, worldview, which essentially takes law, it takes what order is, and makes it untouchable in a way. And the only way that law and order can justify themselves is through its demonstration amidst chaos. And this is why I think monarchy is more anti-fragile, especially with its influence coming from the church and the nobility, and of course some hereditary history, etc. And I think monarchy, in all of its forms, well, disregarding tyrannical and dictatorial demonstrations and examples, in its essence, in its foundations, is more anti-fragile because it justifies itself, and it always reaffirms itself, and it always improves itself with whenever disorder is confronted with the monarch, because the monarch must be an authority figure. The monarch must demonstrate his strength for his stability, and he must demonstrate his quote unquote divinity, quote unquote how do you say it? Well, you get it. Whereas in republics and in democracies, or nonetheless democratic societies, the sovereignty, like, there is no sovereignty, and the people make the law in which only they see fit, regardless if it's beneficial to them or not. As if it's not what they say, it's not. It has nothing to do with them. Whereas within the sovereignty of the law, instead of the sovereignty of the people, the law was untouched, was deemed sacred, and all was deemed sacred, and all was deemed to be put in their place and to know where their place was. And when confronted with disorder, especially like everyone would band together, would feel united under under these institutions, the religious institutions, the nobility, the monarchy, the kingdoms. They would feel more or less uh, a sense of a kinship with what they could not touch. Kind of like a Christian way of like not being able to touch God, but to feel being with God, kind of like that. So again, I would say to end my proposition, monarchy is more anti-fragile because it reaffirms itself amidst chaos, and it has dominated uh, all civilizations uh, for thousands of years, and thus, amidst all that chaos, all those wars, monarchy only got stronger. Monarchy only got better in the arts, better in its politics. It improved again and again. And even with all these civil wars and all these ideological uh, conflicts, they would still nonetheless feel united amidst all these ideological battles and all these civil wars. They would still feel united, and with that, only chaos can be ruled from something that is untouchable, that which is above one's self. Not like chaos cannot be ruled from where it already is. It has to be ruled from above, that which cannot touch. And so, with that philosophy, with that mindset, historically, culturally, artistically, philosophically, it has always overcome all that disorder and all that chaos. So yeah, that's why I think monarchy, historically, philosophically, theoretically, and logically, is more anti-fragile.
All right, so does that conclude your opening statement?
Yep.
All right, thank you. Verigilius Rex, you now have 10 minutes to give your opening statement.
Very well. I will found my argument with an example based in reality, and that is Rome. And I will say that Rome became great because of its tensions. Not only that it had tensions, but that it allowed tensions to grow in it. Now, a monarchy may well have tensions and maybe subsist after them, but it will kill them, it will suppress them. You could not let a ventilation of the tensions that arise in a society. It allows them. And what we see in this situation is that it allows the perfectionment of this society, in this case, a republic. It is these very same tensions that allow the creation of the tribunal office in Rome. As Machiavelli gladly tells us, and I quote in chapter 4, book 1 on the Discourses of Livy, I say that those who condemn the tumults between the nobles and the plebs appear to me to blame those things that were the chief causes for keeping Rome free, and that they paid more attention to the noises and shouts that arose in those tumults than to the good effects that brought forth, and that they did not consider that in every republic there are two different viewpoints, that of the people and that of the nobles, and that all the laws that are made in favor of liberty result from their disunion, as may easily be seen to have happened in Rome. For from Tarquin to the Gracchi, which was more than 300 years, the 11 tumults of Rome really brought forth exiles, and more rarely blood. Nor is it possible, therefore, to judge these tumults harmful, nor divisive to a republic, which in so great a time set into exile no more than 8 or 10 of its citizens because of its differences, and put to death only a few, and condemned in money fined not very many. Nor can a republic in any way with reason be called disordered, where there are so many examples of virtue, for good examples result from good education from good laws, and good laws from those tumults which may inconsiderately condemn. For he who examines well the result of these will not find that they have brought forth any exile or violence prejudicial to the common good, but laws and institutions in benefit of public liberty. What this brought to the Roman Republic after its infancy was this perfectionment of republican theory, which is the mixed form of government. In foundation, it seeks to eradicate the problem of anacyclosis, which is the cycle of governments. You may well point that monarchies have lasted for millennia, but they are not a single entity. We can just look at China and see, well, it was a monarchy for more than 3,000 years, but it was not the same monarchy with the same dynasty. It had 20, 30 dynasties. So we might as well say they died 20 or 30 times. Plus, this means that the principle of republicanism is that of practicality. Its foundation, its objective is set on a functional system of government. What does this has as its consequence is that the Republican will trend to a more nationalistic and grounded form of government than the imperial monarchical one. What do I mean by this, and why is this important? Is because of the question of law, a point which my adversary brought forth. An imperial system, or a monarchical one, whether it expands or it remains at its borders, will bring forth a relativism in its law. Why? Because it only seeks to perpetuate itself based on this conception of law, which is not dependent of the nation. What does this mean? It means that it will have an arbitrarity of the law, either based in a misconception of religion or in a misconception of the source of power, which will be the monarch in this case. This will be the complete subjectivization of the law, which leads to absolute forms of law, absolute morals that must be applied to their empires. Seek, for example, the feudal monarchies of Europe. Wouldn't matter if one were king in Sicily, where they being French, or one being German and being king of Spain. It wouldn't matter at all, because the principle of that government is its arbitrarity of that law. And if we remember, any kind of opposition and tension that would arise will be suppressed and not ventilated. Something that distinguishes this from republics is that republics have citizens when monarchs have subjects. Let me recall another excerpt from the Discourses of Machiavelli, the end lines of the book. Because of the liberality which the Romans showed in giving their civil privilege to foreigners, many new people sprung up in Rome, and these began to have a part in the elections, so that the government began to change and depart from those institutions and principles of those men who have been accustomed to direct it. When Quintus Fabius, who was censor, became aware of this, he put all the new people from whom this disorder derived into 4 tribes so that they should be unable and reduced to small pieces to corrupt all Rome. This was well recognized by Fabius and put into effect a suitable remedy, which without change was so well accepted by the Republic that he merited being called Maximus. Another consequence of this is the place that republics put in law and state. Let me recall an episode of the Book of the Apostles in which Paul, who was a Roman citizen at the time, came into Jerusalem in a synagogue, and the Jews began to cause a tumult because it was heretic. Now, the Romans captured Paul and were ready to flog him. But at this moment, St. Paul said, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman or a citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship, but I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. Now, these were at the times of the imperial, and one can only marvel at the respect that even subjects had for the law, which was an objective perception. It was not based on the arbitrarity of the emperor. No, It was independent from the emperor. Thus, we see that in republics, the law and its origin, its spring, is the state. Its state is different from men, and that is the difference, the source of the law. One can only look at a modern example and see the French Constitution of the Second Republic, Chapter 1 on sovereignty. No individual, no fraction of the people can exert its exercise. That is of sovereignty. This puts an objective measure on the nation and none of its humors, of its internships. It cannot be placed upon the arbitrary rule of men. It cannot be placed on the nebulous foundation of religion. One can only think and see that when one put religion in a position to make laws, only discord will occur, as happened in Rome and the great Christian schisms. One last thing to consider is this, that all republics have as principle virtue. So what this means is that virtue, as part of human nature, requires the bios politicus, that is, the political sphere for human nature to complete itself. Only citizenship leads access to this, because in virtue ethics, strife and obstacles lead to demonstration, which leads to realization. That is the foundation of virtue, is realization into custom and true virtue, not only words, customs. And this is the reason why Rome, allowing its tensions, became perfected in virtue and in republicanism. It grew from it. I finished.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. So now this is the beginning of the rebuttal phase. You get 5 minutes, Verigilius, starting now.
Okay, so as I said in my argumentation, one thing that I rebuke from my opposition is this conception of law that he put forward. Now, he says that law is put in a sacrosanct place where it cannot be diluted. But should only see that if law is put on a specific class of people or a specific set of ideas, especially if it's religion, one will only find discord. If law is put in the hands of men and not of state or something more abstract than men, we'll see this effect of arbitrarity. It will be subject to humors. It will be subject to change. History teaches us that when monarchs, and especially despots and sultans, made a law, they could never retract that law, because the law can never contradict itself. This put them in a position of peril, because in order to do good, that is to do a just act, a useful edict, for example, they would have to go against the laws of their predecessors. This means that by virtue of our nature of putting the law in the place of men, it will be immediately subject to relativity. And one could argue that there could be good men and excellent men to be placed in the throne, like a Frederick the Great or a Louis XIV, that would bring the state to excellence in the French nation, for example. One should only see that once this ruler is dead, the state will revert to its tyranny. Not even 100 years after the death of Louis XIV did France succumb into a revolution. I mean, the worst revolution that it could arrive. Because 100 years before, the Englishmen had also a revolution, but their tyranny was not in such a state that the measures, that means the tensions that arose from that tyranny, sought to resolve. I think I finished.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So your 5 minutes of refutation begins now, Decadent.
All right, so I didn't know he was gonna hit that hard, so I guess I'm gonna have to pull out the big guns. So, my rebuttal will just be what I'm reading from Hans Hermann Hoppe and Bertrand de Jouvenel. So, under Republican rule, exploitation does not disappear. Even though everyone is permitted to enter government, this does not eliminate the distinction between the rulers and the ruled. Government and the governed are not one and the same person. Instead of a king who considers the country his private property, a temporary and interchangeable caretaker is put in monopolistic charge. The caretaker, in this case, the president or prime minister, does not own the country, but as long as he is in office, he's permitted to use it to his and his proteges' advantage. In other words, a president, a prime minister, an elected official is not, as we may like to think, loyal to the people, but loyal to their party. That's where the corruption and the exploitation lies within. And the only concern in a republic, in a democratic society, is one party ruling over all the rest. And it's no surprise that dictatorship and tyranny was the inevitable conclusion of Rome in 31 BC with Caesar, Julius Caesar, which is why I found pretty ironic that Vergilius would mention Rome, even though it turned into a tyranny soon after it established itself as a republic. Now, to continue with the chaos within a republican system or in a democratic social system, I think yes. The principle of law and legality intended as the absolute guarantee of each man's liberty, for instance, Constitution, instead deeming itself untouchable, it aims to justify an absolute commission of that liberty to the discretion of parliamentary aristocracy. The members of an assembly or a senate may become the mere instruments of parties or the playthings of forces outside the assembly altogether. We may know this more popular as corporatism or big banks, the Goldman Sachs, hint, Hillary Clinton. The assembly may become mere instruments of parties or playthings of forces outside the assembly altogether. Parties and forces which are the expression of sexual interests and are all the more dangerous to society for being, as well as the expression of philosophic heresies, as each of them seeks for itself an absolute dominion. A battle ensues in which the stake is now not only for power as the dynastic of conflicts, but the laws themselves, which will no longer be the constant reflection of higher truths, but will chop and change with every fluctuation of fortune in the combat. In a regime of this kind, there will be neither certitude in law nor guarantee for liberty. Instead of worrying about which nations will win, which king will rule, instead, it's only which ideas will win, which party will win. Trivial things. No wonder why there's so much more ideological conflicts in republics and democracies. No wonder why we had more fascism and communism, and no wonder we had more instability and more chaos. Republics breed chaos. Democratic societies breed instability and breed disorder, because instead of uniting each other under a law, under a sanction, under the sacredness of the institution, of the nobility, of the church, of God, of nation, of civilization. Instead, you can only unite yourself with the vote, and your vote is not worth more than the next person. So all you have to look forward to defend, in order to, and no longer you're no longer defended. You're no longer interested in defending your leaders. You're only interested in defending your race, your sex. Your money. You're not like, you can care less with the presidents. I mean, look at the videos on YouTube about college students who can't even name their presidents before they were born. Most presidents before they were born, because they don't care about the leaders anymore. Whereas in monarchs, every king was remembered because they were part of that history. They lived with that history, and it was theirs. They lived that. They grew up knowing that this king was going to live with them and going to die with them. Whereas in republics and democracies, leaders are forgettable.
All right, your 5 minutes is up. So now we begin the cross-examination. Decadent Perspective, you get 10 minutes to cross-examine Verigilius Rex, starting now.
All right. So, Vergilius, do you think that monarchies are have unlimited power?
That monarchies have unlimited power?
Or that their power, since quote unquote, cannot be untouched because of its sacredness, of its sanctity, do you think it's rather unlimited? Or what would convince you that a republic would no longer work? What would have to happen in a republic or in a democratic society in order for you to reconsider your position, or to even maybe improve it?
One of the arguments that is used against republicanism, sometimes confused with democracy, is that it is led to the passions of the people. But if this is true, how much so for one man who is not judged for nothing but its own power? It will be even more led astray by its own passions. That is the nature of the despot. And thus, what I criticize about democracy is that it is arbitrarily impersonated.
All right. Let's see my other questions here. That's a sufficient answer, by the way. Let's see. What else have I got here? But isn't it also true that making laws based on the sovereignty of the people is also arbitrary?
One thing that is certainly confused when reading the ancients is that they used the word people very leniently. And the reason of this confusion is the democracies of our modern world. Now, when the ancient authors use the term people, for example, to mean Roman, they mean the nation. They certainly don't mean the plebs. For when they use the word people, they will also mean the senators, the patricians. They're certainly not the people as we will recognize of that today. So one thing that I must remember you is that I am defending republicanism and certainly not democracy.
But would you admit that republics are can be described as democratic?
Every republic can be described as democratic, as it can be described as aristocratic and monarchical. It is in its nature. Does that suffice?
But what do you think of like instead of electives being instead of representing the people, they only represent their parties? How do you explain Rome turning into Julius Caesar?
How to explain Rome turning to Julius Caesar? Well, if you're criticizing Julius Caesar for being a monarch for a republic, then I don't know why you're criticizing that, because you will be criticizing monarchy as well. But if you say, I mean, can you reiterate the question? Just 1 second.
I mean, how would a republic turn into a tyranny? Just like how in Italy, they ended up with Mussolini.
Oh, to a tyranny. Okay, so you are criticizing.
Like in other words, how can a republic stop tyranny when it has become more more relevant in republics rather than in monarchies?
Now, sorry, can you rephrase that?
All right. How do you explain the tyrannical tendencies of elected leaders rather than in monarchies?
The tyrannical tendencies. I mean, tyrannical tendencies, which I call monarchies, are only bad because they are not republican. So again, I see that you are saying that it is bad to be a republic because it can turn itself into a monarchy. It can degenerate. It can destroy itself into a monarchy. So how are you defending monarchy if you're saying that it is bad when you say that it is good? But if you are talking about its tension and its ability to survive itself and as an state, then again, one must see that republics have so few civil wars contrary to monarchies. Every time a monarch died in, for example, the Muslim world, there was a civil war for the throne. One must never forget this. And if you're criticizing despotism and the corruption of power, then I mean the corruption and the abandonment of the common cause. One must see that there is no common cause in monarchies. It is only an accident, the common cause in monarchies. Every time there was a revolt in monarchies, it was destroyed. It was not negotiated. There was no solution to be found. It must be destroyed. They were outside the law at that moment. That were enemies of the state.
Well, I think you're also suffering from the same misinterpretation that that you may assume that I have of republics in terms of monarchy, because as I see it, the monarchy is, or at least the monarch is considered a responsible person. I mean, the fact alone that the monarch is responsible to God rather than to an assembly or a popular majority is rather admittedly shocking to a secular humanistic mind. But while God cannot be fooled, the masses can. Of course, while it is admittedly true that one cannot fool all people all the time, it does seem that one can fool millions for centuries. History abounds in such examples, especially the history of religions, admittedly. I mean, in spite of the Republican Democratic emphasis on responsible government, subject to the sanction of not getting reelected, the Democratic Republican government nevertheless derives its authority from anonymous, secretly voting masses on a purely numerical basis. It is even impossible to trace the empowering individual, and thus we get what the French authors call the cult of irresponsibility, or as Connell Layden once pointed out. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think that is too democratic, first of all. And secondly, if we are criticizing republicanism based on the whims and the passions of the people and its arbitrarity, how much so is for a ruler to be that? And if you claim that a true monarchy and a good one, for example, is one that follows certain laws and does not turn itself into a tyranny, what is there to stop it from becoming one except the whim of the ruler?
Well, historically speaking, whenever a monarch would, well, I think this would be better if we get cross-examination, not while I'm trying to cross-examine you, but I'll get into that. Just keep that question on for your cross-examination. But that's just nonetheless, I'll find that a sufficient answer for now for my cross-examination. Let's see. What else have I got for you? It's an interesting thing that you say that back then they considered the republics. Well, I still think it's more probable for a republic to dissolve more into chaos and dissolve more into disorder, because admittedly at first it may seem noble to build a responsible government from electing certain political talents, intellectual elites, say. But nonetheless, how do you prevent these electorates to dissolve into only being obedient to their party?
One thing to consider about this revolts and problems and tensions arising in republics and bringing down their destruction is that when this happens in a monarchy, it just as well happens in a republic. The revolts happen all the times in monarchies. There is a succession crisis. There is an inherited crisis. There is the nobles who want to rebel, who are more privileges. And it is quenched by blood, by force, I mean. When this happens in a republic, it is not quenched by force, it is quenched by another medium, and that is the law, virtue, and principles of the republic. So, if you say that that a republic can die of discourses, of course, everything can die of discourses, but when the republic dies, it dies for good. Why? Because it does not have these arbitrary principles. Monarchy does. If you dismantle the dynasty, another one can be put in place because it doesn't matter who is in the ruling dynasty. It is
Excuse me,
just as arbitrary as that.
the time for cross-examination on Decadent's Perspective is ended. Now, Verigilius Rex, your 10 minutes of cross-examination begin now.
Okay. So one thing I want to ask you, Decadent, is this critique you make of republics that they don't even remember their presidents, but that monarchies do remember their kings. Well, do you believe that this is because there are few kings, or because the ones you were criticizing were democracies?
I'm sorry, you'll have to rephrase that.
How would I put it? You praise that subjects in monarchies can remember their monarchs, right?
Well, yeah, they have more special place in their heart than in replaceable caretakers.
Very interesting. So, how do you correlate this with the Romans naming their years after 2 consuls, which would mean that a 10-year period would have to remember 20 consuls, 20 names of consuls?
Well, certainly there are exceptions in republics. I mean,
so can you name a republic that is not a democracy? I mean, republic that did not do this?
Did not do what necessarily?
That did not pay attention to its rulers, to show a little how you say it, little interest. Can you name one?
Well, I can certainly think of the United States. And there's also Switzerland. I mean, hardly anyone in Western civilization knows any Swiss leaders, even though the Swiss Republic is the longest lasting republic next to France, I believe. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's like, I mean, historically speaking, besides the beginning of a republic and the end of a republic, most of the leaders aren't really looked into amongst the average layman. But if your question is whether or not these governments neglect their leaders, I think simply by the fact alone that they're replaceable every few years, regardless of their efficiency or regardless of their likability and their preferability, I think is much more revealing on how they treat their leaders instead of in monarchies where if they were there to stay, and so they had to do their best, and especially in solving problems, in solving chaotic situations, because they didn't know if the next day was going to be their last day. They didn't know if they were going to be there for 20 years or the next 50 years or the next 10 days. And so whenever a problem would arise, they would do their best to fix it because they knew it was theirs. Whereas in republics, if a chaos ensued, if something ridiculous and pretty dangerous were rising amidst the society that they were in control of, they would just simply neglect it and hope the next leader would probably do it. Because since they're replaceable, it doesn't. And since they're only going to be there, since they know how long they're going to be there for maybe 5 more years or 10 more years, they think, oh, just leave it to the next person because I'm not going to be here. And besides, if It's not my fault. It's the party's fault. I'm loyal to the party, and the people chose the party. So yeah, I don't know. I just think it's more revealing in republics, more chaotic in republics.
Again, you used as an example modern democracies, but I was talking about republics.
Well, I thought I was talking about France, Italy, and Switzerland. I mean,
Those are most democratic, especially Switzerland, which is at the fringe of direct democracy.
well, what about Finland? It's another very long lasting republic, constitutional republic.
But is it a democracy?
Oh, well, there's voting. There's there's voting ages. There's restrictions to voting. So yeah, I mean, and then they have a parliament too.
So we see that this is a problem of democracies and not of republics.
But if you're only applying republics to ancient Rome, then frankly, it's a very limited interpretation. We're talking about. I mean, I was under the impression that the debate was going to be about which system is better, regardless of regardless of its historical height, rather than its historical reputation.
We're discussing republicanism and monarchy. Therefore, I can take that example. I can make the abstraction. The theory is valid. So another thing I wish to ask you is, you said that republics create chaos, or rather allow chaos, and this brings about the destruction. Did you say that?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily brings about destruction. I would just say it's more likely to cause more chaotic and more chaos and more disorder amongst its citizenry, amongst its political parties, amongst its elected officials, and thus making it more corrupt. I'm just saying it's more fragile than anti-fragile. That's all I'm saying.
Very well. So you're arguing that a monarchy that allows this corruption would not have the problem of becoming corrupt because it already allows this corruption. When we are talking about revolts, one must see that monarchies suppressed revolts. They do not try to work out revolts because the principle of these revolts is completely different. What I'm trying to say is that when we talk about monarchies, we must remember that they do not care about what is right, what is wrong. Therefore, its survivability, its ability to function in strife, is not based on any ethical framework. Therefore, we must concede that monarchies must be able to operate outside an ethical framework in order to outlive its own revolts, its own deficiencies.
I mean, I guess if you want me to respond with that, I can. That was more like a statement, not really a question. But I mean, historically speaking, whenever a monarch, be it in China or in Europe or Russia, it didn't really matter. Whenever there was, whenever their family or their nobility, their church would notice that they may have gone haywire, usually they would be replaced temporarily by a regency, which would be more like the monarch's right-hand man. But of course, it would only be temporary until the next person in the monarch's line was fit to rule as king. Whereas in republics, nothing would necessarily change, even if a president or a prime minister were to go haywire. Of course, there would be a vice president, but again, they would wouldn't necessarily change what the king was the president was already had his eyes set on. Besides, I think when a monarch, I mean, quote unquote, they kind of owned a certain society, a certain nation. So whenever someone owns something, they want to take care of it. They want to make sure it's in their interest that what they own gets better or more valuable. So with monarchs, they would be more or less interested in either keeping keeping the nation as it was before they were a king, or making it better than before. And it gives them it always gave each monarch a sense of continuity, that to keep their reputation, to make sure that they don't disrespect themselves, and they don't basically break themselves off of their own glory. Whereas, like I said, in republics, it was neglectable. They can neglect what the last person did because either they were not of their party or because they don't agree with their politics. But regardless of whether they agreed or not, in monarchy, there was always a sense of unity under their hereditary and noble attitudes.
Excuse me, the time is up for the cross-examination of VREX. Now begins the 5-minute closing statement by Verigilius Rex.
Okay. So I will end up my position by talking about the how it's called, talking about the position that virtue has in republics. Now, it is said by Montesquieu, for example, that the spring of any republic is virtue. Why is this? It's because the sovereignty lies in the people, and again, I mean people by nation. Therefore, we see that this sets already a goal, like principles, like rules, so to speak. This necessarily gives an objectivity to the Republican state that is outside any subjective whim of any of its constituent factions. What we mean by this is that by analyzing the inner workings of any society, of any human group, independent group that form up nations that we can observe in nature, we see that this will have inherent natures, inherent predispositions that must necessarily establish principles, consequence. This is materialized in constitutions, in laws, in forms of government. This is the justification of the nation state and of the republican state. I argue that this is certainly not the case in monarchies, that monarchies have an internationalist tendency, because the spring of its power, the justification of it, has nothing to do with virtue, certainly, and also has nothing to do with the nation that it rules. It is independent from it. The driving force of monarchies, which will eventually be its downfall, is that this force, this spring, is placed on a height that is not found in nature. It is either, as I said, on the passion rule and the arbitrariness of its rulers, which may as well rule well, but by convention, which may rule well, but by theological fog. This is certainly a case that will create discord, that will be, in time, unable to deal with the problems that arise in that same society. One must only see at our present situation of why there are really no monarchies really left in this world today, because of their inability to act upon the tensions that arose on the past 2 centuries. They were completely irresponsive. They were completely ineffectual to answer the problems that arose on our age. They're completely useless. And if they retained their monarchy, we will see that they only retain a titular monarchy, like England, like Sweden, where the monarch has really no power, and they have degenerated into democracies, proper democracies, under the name of republics, but proper democracies. What this means is that monarchies and democracies are all inside the anacyclosis theory, which is the cycle of governments. Their existence has the inherent consequence of its downfall, of its degeneration. No state that has not as its principle a functioning practicality and an inherent objectivity based on its constituency will be able to solve these problems. There we go.
All right, thank you. Now, Decadent Perspective, you have 5 minutes for your closing statement.
All right. Well, as I've said before, that in republics, the urge for fraternity is more revealing, as is demonstrated from people like Julius Caesar and Mussolini, even people like Hitler, who arose from the Weimar Republic. Now, I'll just also end by quoting Wilhelm Röpke, who was an Austrian economist, not of the Austrian school, mind you. He didn't really like the Austrian school, but this is what he had to say: that in a sound society, leadership, responsibility, and exemplary defense of the society's guiding norms and values must be the exalted duty and unchallengeable right of a minority that forms and is willing and respectfully recognized as the apex of a social pyramid hierarchically structured by performance. That is what those have in mind who say that the revolt of the masses must be controlled by another revolt, the revolt of the elite. What we need is a true nobilitatis naturalis. No era can do without it, least of all ours, when so much is shaking and crumbling away. We need a natural nobility, whose authority is fortunately readily accepted by all men, an elite deriving its title solely from supreme performance and peerless moral example, and invested with the moral dignity of such a life. Only a few from every stratum of society can ascend into this thin layer of natural nobility. The way to it is an exemplary and slowly maturing life of dedicated endeavor on behalf of all, unimpeachable integrity, constant restraint of our common greed, proved soundness of judgment, spotless private life, indomitable courage, and standing up for truth and law, and generally the highest example. This is how the few, carried upward by the trust of the people, gradually attain to a position above the classes, interests, passions, wickedness, and foolishness of men, and finally become the nation's conscience. To belong to this group of moral aristocrats should be the highest and most desirable aim, next to which all the other triumphs of life are pale and insipid. No free society, least of all ours, which threatens to degenerate into mass society, can subsist without such a class of censors. The continued existence of our free world will ultimately depend on whether our age can produce a sufficient number of such aristocrats of public spirit. The nobility, I think, is what made a balance in society, in culture, among all people. Again, with a monarchy, people are united by nation, whereas in a republic, people are united by their ideas, their race, their sex, demeaning things. They're atomized by republics because they're only they're only as good as their representatives, and the representatives are only loyal to their party, their section, and not their nation, not their people, not their culture. In fact, they'd rather neglect their culture because instead of respecting something from above, they only respect what's on their ground, their feet, the people around them. And if there's no authority, if there's no something that which the foundation can be ruled from that which is untouchable, that which is sacred, I think we've seen out more than a political decline, a political degeneracy, a cultural degeneracy, and an ideological, chaotic demonstration of pure idiocy and neglection and negation as well. So yeah, that's my closing statement. Monarchy is best. Republics are for dreamers who should go back to sleep.
All right. Thank you, Decadent Perspective, and thank you, Vergilius, for participating in this debate. This is Todd Lewis, the host, signing off.